On the morning of June 11th, 1986, 14 people were eliminated across the remote hollows of McDowell County, West Virginia, in what would become known as the Tug Fork Massacre. All adults, all connected to a single theft that occurred 5 weeks earlier. The method was systematic: hunting rifles from concealed positions, ambushes on mountain roads, executions in homes where families slept. The perpetrators weren't rival gangs or organized criminals. They were 4 members of the Wilson family, a father and his 3 sons, moving through the mountains like avenging spirits, methodically erasing everyone who touched what belonged to them. The FBI would later call it the most calculated mass elimination in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't drugs, wasn't a blood feud passed down through generations, wasn't even retaliation for violence. It was a 600-pound copper moonshine, still worth $12,000, that disappeared in the night. And one man's unshakable belief that mountain justice mattered more than any law written in distant capitals. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. McDowell County, West Virginia, sprawled across 535 square miles of the most unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States in 1986. The mountains rose like ancient fortress walls, their peaks reaching over 4,000 feet, their valleys narrow and deep, that sunlight only touched the bottom for 3 hours each winter day. Population stood around 35,000, down from 98,000 in the boom years of the 1950s when coal was king and men died underground to feed America's furnaces. The county seat, Welch, held barely 3,000 souls who knew each other's business, secrets, and grudges, going back to before the First World War. June in the mountains meant temperatures climbing to 78 degrees by afternoon, dropping to 52 at night when fog rolled down from the ridges like something alive. The air smelled like wood smoke from coal stoves that never fully went cold, wild honeysuckle growing thick along abandoned railroad grades, and the particular metallic scent of mountain streams running cold over shale and limestone. At dawn, you'd hear mourning doves calling across the hollers, the distant sound of diesel engines as coal trucks ground up impossible grades, and sometimes the crack of a rifle as someone took a deer out of season because their family needed meat more than they feared game wardens. But 1986 was a catastrophic year for coal country. The industry that had sustained McDowell County for nearly a century was in free fall. Mines that had employed thousands now sat abandoned, their entrances sealed with concrete and chain link, their tipples rusting in the rain like monuments to a dead god. Unemployment in McDowell County hovered at 43% that June. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives 3,000 feet underground, breathing coal dust, risking their lives for union wages that once meant something, now had nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no way to feed their families except disability checks that barely covered rent and food stamps, that bought humiliation at the checkout counter, along with government cheese and powdered milk. The average household income was $8,400 a year. In some hollows, it was half that. The physical geography shaped everything. Tug Fork River ran along the county's western edge, marking the border with Kentucky, its waters running brown with acid mine drainage that had killed every fish for 50 miles. The mountains themselves were laced with thousands of miles of dirt roads, logging trails, and paths that appeared on no maps, known only to families who'd walked them for generations. Some hollows were so remote that mail came once a week if the creek wasn't flooded. Some families had no running water, no electricity, no telephone. They lived like their great-grandparents had lived, except poorer, because at least their great-grandparents had hope. In that economic wasteland, some families turned to the oldest Appalachian tradition, moonshine. Not the romantic grandfather's recipe stuff from folk songs. This was business. Illegal distilling that could bring in more cash in 2 months than a year of legitimate work if you had the equipment, the know-how, and the courage to risk federal prison. The mountains provided everything needed. Hidden hollows, where law enforcement rarely ventured. Cold spring water that came out of the ground at 42 degrees year-round, and a network of back roads where you could see headlights coming from 2 miles away. The McDowell County Sheriff's Department had 11 deputies to cover 535 square miles. State Police Barracks sat 47 miles away in Princeton. FBI presence was theoretical at best. In McDowell County, the law was more a suggestion than a reality, and most people preferred it that way. They'd learned long ago that outside authority brought nothing but trouble, that mountain people settled their own debts, solved their own problems, and answered to codes older than any government. Sound traveled strange in those mountains. Sometimes you'd hear a conversation a mile away, clear as if the speaker stood beside you. Other times you wouldn't hear a man walking 10 feet behind you until his shadow fell across your path. James Edward Wilson was 49 years old that June. Though he looked closer to 60, he stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, but age and injury had stooped him forward so he appeared shorter, his shoulders permanently rounded from 3 decades spent hunched in coal seams, barely 4 feet high. His hands were enormous, knuckles swollen with arthritis that made them ache when rain was coming, fingers permanently blackened by coal dust that no amount of lava soap could remove. A thick scar ran from his right temple down to his jaw, a souvenir from Chosin Reservoir in Korea, where Chinese artillery had caught his position and killed 11 of the 12 men in his squad. He walked with a pronounced limp, legacy of a roof collapse in the Pocahontas No. 4 mine in 1971 that had crushed his left leg and ended his underground career at age 34. Every morning, James woke at 4:45, made coffee in a percolator so old the bottom had worn thin and had to be set just right on the burner or it would tip. He drank it black and strong enough to dissolve a spoon, sitting at his kitchen table reading from a King James Bible his mother had given him in 1954 when he left for the Army. He'd read 1 chapter, smoked 2 unfiltered Pall Mall cigarettes rolled so tight they lasted 20 minutes each, then step outside to watch the sun come up over Beartown Mountain. By 5:30, he'd be walking the 2 miles up Stillhouse Hollow to check the operation that kept his family fed. He'd married Sarah Louise Hatfield in 1957, right after his discharge from the Army. The marriage connected 2 of the oldest families in McDowell County, families that had been making shine since before West Virginia was a state. They'd had 3 sons. Michael was 28 now, married to Rebecca, with 2 small children. Robert was 26, engaged to a girl from over in Mercer County. Travis was 23, the youngest, still trying to figure out who he was beyond being James Wilson's son. Sarah was 47, her face worn smooth by worry like riverstone polished by decades of current. She'd buried both her parents in mining accidents, watched the county slowly die around her, and now lived with the knowledge that her husband and sons were one informant away from 20 years in federal prison. What James valued most wasn't the money from moonshine, though God knew they needed every dollar with 3 adult sons to help support and grandchildren who deserved better than government cheese. What James valued was the idea that a man could still make his own way in the world without bowing to government regulations that made no sense in the mountains, without begging banks for loans they'd never grant to people like him, without accepting that the system's failure meant his family had to fail too. His grandfather, Ezra Wilson, had made shine during Prohibition, when half of McDowell County ran stills and the other half bought from them. His father, Edward Wilson, had made it through the Depression when legal liquor was a luxury mountain families couldn't afford, and homemade was survival. James saw it as inheritance, tradition, and the only form of independence left to a man who'd spent his youth crawling through coal seams for wages that destroyed his body while making other men rich. The still itself represented everything. It had cost him $12,000, assembled piece by piece over 4 years, not some hardware store copper pot and automobile radiator like amateurs used. This was a custom-built system, 600 pounds of genuine copper coil, precision welded joints, temperature gauges, accurate to 1 degree, and a condenser designed by a man in Kentucky who'd been building stills since 1948. The copper alone had cost $8,000. The rest went to fabrication, transport, and installation in a location so remote that James had to clear a half-mile of trail just to get the pieces back there, on a 4-wheeler pulling a trailer. That still could produce 30 gallons of finished product in a single run. At $40 a gallon to distributors, that meant $1,200 every 3 days. James ran it carefully, never pushing too hard, never getting greedy. 10 runs a month meant $12,000. After expenses for corn, sugar, propane, in paying his sons for their labor, James cleared $8,000 a month, $96,000 a year, tax-free, in a county where the median income was $8,400. But it wasn't about the money. The still represented his family's future, his independence, his defiance of a world that had taken everything else from him. It was proof that mountain people could still survive on their own terms, could still practice traditions their grandfathers had taught them, could still tell the government that some things weren't any of their business. The operation had been running for 6 years without trouble. Michael James Wilson was 28 years old that June, built like his father had been before the mines broke him down. 6 feet 1 inch tall, 210 pounds of muscle earned from loading trucks and cutting timber, not from any gym. He had his father's dark hair, his mother's green eyes, and a quiet intensity that made people nervous when they first met him. He'd married Rebecca Ann Collins in 1981. They had 2 children, James Jr., age 4, and Sarah Marie, age 2. Michael worked at a sawmill in Eager when the mill had work. which was maybe 3 days a week if they were lucky. The rest of the time, he helped his father with the still, made deliveries, and did whatever needed doing to keep his family fed. Robert Edward Wilson was 26, leaner than his older brother, 6 feet tall and 185 pounds, with the kind of wiry strength that came from never stopping, never resting. He'd been engaged to Linda Sue Morrison for 2 years, kept postponing the wedding because he wanted to save enough money to buy a trailer of their own instead of starting married life in his parents' basement. Robert worked odd jobs, fixed cars for cash, and spent most of his time helping run the still operation. He was the one who handled distribution, who knew which back roads to take when hauling product, who'd never been stopped by police because he was careful, methodical, and never took unnecessary risks. Travis Lee Wilson was 23, the youngest, still angry about everything, in the way young men get angry when they realize the world isn't what they were promised. He stood 5 feet 11 inches tall, 175 pounds, lean and quick. With his father's temper before age, and injury had taught patience, Travis had tried to join the Army like his father, got rejected for a juvenile record he'd picked up at 17, destruction of property, charges later dropped after he paid restitution for smashing the windows of a store that had refused to give his mother credit. He worked at a garage in Welch, $40 a week under the table, and spent his free time hunting, fishing, and helping with the still. The three brothers weren't particularly close in the sentimental sense. They didn't sit around talking about feelings or memories, but they understood each other completely, shared a code that required no discussion, and would die for each other without hesitation, because that's what Wilson men did. Raymond Dale Hargrove was 42 years old that spring, though the mountains had aged him until he looked closer to 55. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, built thick and solid from years of physical labor, with a barrel chest and arms like tree trunks. His beard had gone mostly gray, though his hair still held some of its original brown. He had a loud, friendly voice, the kind of man who remembered everyone's name, asked about their families, and could tell stories that kept a room laughing for hours. For 8 years, he'd worked alongside James Wilson in the Pocahontas No. 4 mine. Shared shifts in darkness, 3,000 feet underground. Trusted each other with their lives in a place where one mistake meant everyone died. Raymond had a family too. His wife Martha was 41, worn down by poverty and worry, until she looked like an old woman. They had 3 sons, Daniel, 26, who worked at a garage in Iger, Marcus, 24, who hauled timber when anyone was hiring, and Carl, 21, newly married to a girl named Jessica who was 4 months pregnant with their first child. Raymond's extended network included his younger brother Thomas, 38, and a collection of cousins, neighbors, and associates who'd all grown up in the same hollows, attended the same churches, worked in the same mines until the mines shut down. These weren't criminals by nature, weren't organized thieves or career outlaws. They were men who'd played by the rules their entire lives and watched the rules fail them completely. Men who'd believed that hard work guaranteed survival, that loyalty to companies meant job security, that doing right meant things would work out. The coal industry had taught them different. It had used their bodies, broken their health, then thrown them away like worn-out equipment when cheaper. Methods came along. Raymond's father had died of black lung in 1978, drowning slowly in his own destroyed lungs after 43 years underground. Raymond himself had been laid off in 1983 when Island Creek Coal closed the Pocahontas mine. His unemployment had run out 18 months ago. His disability claim had been denied twice. His family survived on food stamps. His wife's part-time job cleaning houses and whatever cash he could scrape together doing odd jobs that never quite added up to a living. What Raymond needed was a way out, a stake, enough money to maybe start over somewhere else, or at least buy some breathing room from creditors who were circling like vultures. When Tommy Lee Baker mentioned that James Wilson's still was sitting unguarded in Stillhouse Hollow 2 miles from any house, when he mentioned that 600 pounds of copper was worth $12,000 to a scrap dealer in Bluefield, when he mentioned that James Wilson had made more money in the last 6 years than all of them would see in a lifetime, Raymond had listened. Not because he wanted to hurt James. They'd been friends once, had trusted each other. But friendship was a luxury Raymond couldn't afford anymore. And that copper represented everything. A truck, a security deposit on an apartment, a chance to move his family somewhere with actual jobs, 1 night of work for 6 years of security. The plan came together over 3 weeks in April. 14 men total, enough to haul 600 pounds of copper through 2 miles of mountain trail in one trip. They'd move on Saturday, May 3rd, when James Wilson would be at his daughter-in-law's house for a birthday party and wouldn't check the still until Monday morning. They'd use the old logging road that came within half a mile, carry the still out in pieces, load it onto Raymond's flatbed truck, and have it to the scrap dealer in Bluefield before dawn Sunday. Split 14 ways, $12,000 meant $857 each. Not a fortune, but enough to matter, enough to make a difference. May 3rd was a warm night, temperature holding at 68 degrees even after the sun went down. No moon, just starlight filtering through clouds that threatened rain, but never delivered. 14 men gathered at 9:30 in the evening at the abandoned Consolidation Coal office on Route 16. They had tools, flashlights, work gloves, and a single-minded focus born of desperation. Nobody talked much. They all knew what they were doing, knew it was wrong, knew they were stealing from a man who'd call it more than theft. But desperation makes thieves of honest men, and every one of them had families who needed that money more than James Wilson needed another month's take from a still that had already made him rich by mountain standards. They reached the still site at 10:15. The clearing was exactly where Tommy Lee had said, hidden so well you'd walk past it 20 times and never know it was there. James Wilson woke at 4:45 on Monday morning, June 4th, as he did every morning, made his coffee, read his Bible chapter, Proverbs 16, about pride going before destruction, smoked his 2 cigarettes on the porch while the sky turned from black to gray to pale blue. The temperature was 54 degrees, dew heavy on the grass, fog thick in the hollows. By 5:30 he was walking up Stillhouse Hollow, following the trail he'd walked 6,000 times, his boots finding purchase on familiar ground, even in the half-dark. He knew something was wrong before he reached the clearing. The birds were quiet, and birds were never quiet at dawn unless something had disturbed them recently. The underbrush showed damage, broken branches, and trampled ferns. where something large had been dragged through. James felt his stomach go cold, felt that combat sense from Korea, waking up after 33 years of sleep, the one that said, danger, ambush, something fundamentally wrong with the world. The clearing was empty, not just empty of people, empty of everything. The still was gone, all 600 pounds of it, dismantled and carried away like it had never existed. The concrete pad where it had stood for 6 years showed scrape marks. The propane tank was gone. The tools, the thermometers, the collection jars, everything, even the scrap copper James kept for repairs. They'd taken it all, stripped the place clean, left nothing but bare ground, and the smell of propane that had leaked when they disconnected the tank without proper care. James stood very still in that empty clearing for 5 minutes, not moving, barely breathing, while something inside him calcified into something harder and colder than coal. He didn't shout or curse or rage. He just stood there, feeling the weight of what this meant settle on him like a cave-in, like a roof collapse, like the moment you realize you're buried alive and no one's coming to dig you out. That still represented 6 years of work, $12,000 in materials, $96,000 a year in income. It represented his independence, his family's security, his ability to provide for his sons and granddaughter. More than that, it represented tradition, legacy, the idea that Wilson men didn't bow to anyone. Someone had taken all of that in one night, had stripped him bare, had stolen not just copper, but everything it represented. James felt no anger yet. Anger was hot, and anger was useless. What he felt was cold calculation. James walked back down Stillhouse Hollow with the morning sun breaking through the fog, turning the dew to steam. He didn't go to his house. He went to the barn behind it, the old tobacco barn his grandfather had built in 1923, where the wood still smelled like burley leaf, even though no one had grown tobacco in 30 years. He sat on a nail keg in the dim light, filtering through gaps in the siding, and rolled a cigarette with hands that didn't shake because he wouldn't allow them to shake. He smoked it slowly, thinking through everything he knew about what had happened. 14 men, minimum, based on the tracks. Maybe more. They'd used the old logging road, which meant they knew the area well, weren't outsiders. They'd taken everything in one trip, which meant organization, planning, not some opportunistic theft. They'd known he'd be away Saturday night, which meant someone close enough to know his schedule. And they'd left nothing behind except tracks that rain would erase and memories that wouldn't. At 7:30, James walked to his house, to the kitchen where Sarah was making breakfast, where she took one look at his face and went pale. He called his sons. Michael arrived at 8:15 from his trailer a mile down the road. Robert showed up at 8:20 from the basement room where he still lived. Travis came at 8:30, drove his truck hard up the driveway, already sensing something had shifted in the world. They gathered in the barn, 4 men in the half-dark, and James spoke 14 words. They took the still, every piece. We're going to find them, and we're going to end them. No one asked who. No one asked if he was sure. No one suggested calling the sheriff or trying to negotiate or accepting the loss and moving on, because they were Wilson men, and Wilson men didn't accept theft of what was theirs. They didn't call outside authority to solve mountain problems, and they didn't forgive violations of the code their grandfather had taught their father had taught them. Michael asked one question. "How many?" James said, 14, maybe more. "We find them all." Robert said, "When?" James said, "When we know every name and every location. Could be a week, could be 2, but we don't move until we're sure." Travis said nothing, just nodded, and in that nod was everything he'd been waiting for his whole angry life: a purpose, a target, a reason to become what the world had tried to make him anyway. They started that afternoon with the tracks. James walked his sons back up to Stillhouse Hollow, showed them the clearing, let them see what had been taken. Then they followed the drag marks through the woods to the old logging road, found tire impressions in the soft dirt where it had rained 2 days after the theft. Robert photographed them with a Polaroid camera, measured the tread width and pattern. Looked like a flatbed truck, heavy load, based on how deep the tracks cut. Tuesday, June 5th. Michael drove to Eager, to Welch, to all the small towns in a 30-mile radius, asking careful questions at diners and gas stations. Who'd come into money recently? Who'd been spending more than usual? Who'd seemed nervous or guilty or too eager to explain where they'd gotten cash? People talked in small towns, especially to someone like Michael who'd grown up there, whose family went back 6 generations. By Wednesday evening, he had 3 names: Raymond Hargrove, Tommy Lee Baker, Daniel Foster. Men James knew, men he'd worked with, men who knew exactly what that still meant. Wednesday through Friday, Robert watched Raymond's house from the woods across the road, watched who came and went, counted 14 different men over 3 days, some staying for hours, all of them looking nervous, looking over their shoulders like they knew consequence was coming, but didn't know when. Robert wrote down license plates, noted times, mapped movements. By Friday evening, he had all 14 names: Raymond and his brother Thomas, Raymond's 3 sons, Tommy Lee Baker and his 2 cousins, Daniel Foster and his nephew, Marcus Webb, Carl Hoskins, James Pritchard, Billy Ray Sloan, Stephen Keith Morrison. Saturday, James sent Travis to Bluefield to check scrap dealers. Took him 6 stops before he found the one who'd bought 600 pounds of copper coil the previous Sunday. Paid $6,300 in cash to Raymond Hargrove, who'd had a bill of sale saying it came from a demolished Stillhouse over in Kentucky. The dealer remembered because Raymond had been nervous, kept looking at the door, and had taken payment in 50s and 20s instead of a check. Sunday, June 10th, the 4 Wilson men gathered in the barn again. James had a list of 14 names written in pencil on the back of an envelope. 14 addresses, 14 routines, 14 men who'd stolen 6 years of his life's work and thought mountain silence meant they'd gotten away with it. James Wilson woke at 3:30 on Wednesday morning, June 11th, 2 hours earlier than usual. The temperature was 51 degrees, fog so thick you couldn't see 30 feet. He didn't make coffee, didn't read his Bible, didn't smoke his cigarettes. He dressed in dark clothes, lace-up boots, a canvas jacket with deep pockets. By 4 o'clock, his 3 sons were in the barn, dressed the same way, faces set like men going to work. They'd rather not do, but wouldn't shirk from. They loaded the truck. 430-06 hunting rifles, scoped and zeroed, 2 12-gauge shotguns, boxes of ammunition, thermoses of coffee they wouldn't drink, a list of 14 names and addresses. They didn't talk. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been understood in the 7 days of watching. This wasn't rage. This was accounting, balancing books, settling debts. The only way the mountains allowed when law was 47 miles away and justice was whatever men made of it. James drove. Michael sat beside him. Robert and Travis followed in Robert's truck. They moved through pre-dawn darkness like a convoy heading to war, which is exactly what it was, a war over copper and honor, and the idea that some violations demanded blood. Raymond Dale Hargrove woke at 4:30 to use the bathroom, same as he did every morning, because his prostate was shot and he had to piss 3 times a night. He was 50 yards from his house, walking back from the outhouse in his undershirt and jeans, when the rifle shot came from the tree line 200 yards away. The bullet hit him just below the left shoulder blade, angled down through his chest, exited below his right collarbone. Raymond fell forward into the wet grass, tried to breathe, couldn't, felt his lungs filling with blood. He died at 4:33, face down in his own yard, while his wife slept inside, while morning fog drifted through the hollow like smoke. Thomas Wayne Hargrove, Raymond's younger brother, lived a quarter-mile down the road in a trailer he'd been buying for 11 years. He woke at 5:15 to get ready for a construction job in Princeton, $40 for the day if the weather held. He was standing at his kitchen sink, filling a coffee pot with water, when the kitchen window exploded inward. The 12-gauge blast caught Thomas in the right side of his chest and neck, tore through muscle and bone and artery. He dropped where he stood, coffee pot shattering on the linoleum, water mixing with blood that pumped from his carotid in diminishing spurts. His wife Jennifer started screaming, grabbed their phone to call 911. Found the line was dead because Travis had cut it 10 minutes earlier. Thomas bled out in 4 minutes while Jennifer held pressure on wounds too massive to stop, while their 2 children woke in the back bedroom and started crying because they heard their mother screaming. Marcus Anthony Webb was 29 years old, lived with his mother in a house on Trace Mountain Road. He worked night shift at a truck stop in Bluefield. Got home at 6:30 Wednesday morning, tired and thinking about sleep. He parked his Ford Ranger in the gravel driveway, grabbed his lunchbox, started walking toward the house. The rifle shot came from behind him, from the woods across the road. The bullet entered the base of his skull, traveled upward through his brainstem, killed him so fast he was dead before his body understood it should fall. Marcus collapsed on his mother's front steps at 6:37. She found him 20 minutes later when she came out to call him for breakfast. Carl Dean Hoskins lived in Ieger, in a rental house behind the old company store. He was 26, married 8 months to Jessica, who was 5 months pregnant with their first child. Carl worked at a sawmill when the mill had work, which it hadn't for 3 weeks. Wednesday morning at 7:45, he was in his side yard trying to fix a lawnmower that wouldn't start, bent over the engine, socket wrench in his hand. The shotgun blast came from the alley behind his house. Double-aught buckshot at 30 yards caught him across the back and shoulders. 9 pellets that shattered his spine and tore through his lungs and heart. He died in his yard, while his pregnant wife watched from the kitchen window, while she screamed his name, while neighbors came running and found nothing they could do. Tommy Lee Baker was 37, lived with his girlfriend, Donna, in a rented trailer outside Welch. He'd been nervous for a week, sleeping poorly, jumping at sounds, telling Donna maybe they should go visit her sister in Ohio for a while. Wednesday morning at 9:30, Tommy decided he couldn't stay in the trailer anymore. Couldn't sit still with his nerves screaming that something was coming. He told Donna he was going to check on his cousin Daniel, grabbed his keys, walked out to his truck. Michael Wilson was waiting in the tree line 60 yards away, had been waiting since 8 o'clock, because he'd known Tommy would run eventually, known fear would make him move. The rifle shot took Tommy in the chest as he reached for his truck door. He staggered backward, sat down hard on the gravel driveway, looked down at the blood spreading across his shirt like he couldn't quite believe what was happening. He died at 9:34, slumped against his truck's front tire while Donna screamed from the doorway, while Michael packed up his rifle and walked calmly back through the woods to where Robert waited with the truck. Daniel Marcus Foster was 41, lived alone in a cabin up Horsepen Hollow, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. He'd worked with James Wilson for 15 years in the mines, had trusted him, had been trusted in return until desperation made him choose copper over friendship. Wednesday, at 11:15, Daniel was cutting firewood behind his cabin, chainsaw screaming through oak when the pain hit his lower back. He dropped the chainsaw, reached behind him, felt the wetness, couldn't understand what was happening. The rifle shot had come from 300 yards away, across the hollow, from a position Travis had scouted 3 days earlier. The bullet had hit Daniel's right kidney, torn through his abdomen, lodged against his spine. He tried to walk toward his cabin, made it 10 feet before his legs stopped working. He collapsed in his own woodyard, chainsaw still running beside him until it ran out of gas and bled to death over 45 minutes, alone, with no one to hear him calling for help. James Pritchard Jr. was 33, worked as a mechanic, lived with his parents in Cucumber Hollow. Wednesday at 1:20, he was under a car in his driveway, changing oil, radio playing country music when the shotgun blast came from behind the car. He never saw who fired it, never knew what hit him. The buckshot caught him in the legs and lower torso, severed his femoral artery. He tried to pull himself out from under the car, couldn't, bled out in 8 minutes. Billy Ray Sloan was 28, married with 1 daughter, age 6. He worked at a garage in Welch, got off shift at 3 o'clock. Wednesday afternoon, drove his motorcycle home like he did every day. He lived on a dirt road off Route 16, had to ride past a blind curve where the road cut through rock. Robert Wilson waited there with a shotgun, hidden behind an outcropping, waited until he heard the motorcycle engine, stepped out, fired once. Billy Ray never had time to brake. The blast hit him in the chest at 15 feet, knocked him off the bike. He slid 40 feet on the gravel, the bike tumbling end over end. He died before the bike stopped sliding. Stephen Keith Morrison was 35, engaged to Robert Wilson's girlfriend, Linda's cousin, which made the betrayal personal in ways that ran deeper than money. Wednesday at 4:15, Stephen was at home watching television, heard a knock at his door, opened it thinking it might be Linda, bringing her cousin by to talk about wedding plans. Robert stood on the porch with a hunting rifle. Stephen saw the gun, tried to slam the door. The bullet went through the door, through Stephen's chest, through the wall behind him. He died in his hallway while his mother, who lived in the back bedroom, called 911 and begged for help that would arrive 35 minutes too late. Daniel Ray Hargrove, Raymond's oldest son, was 26, married with 2 children. He'd known this was coming, had felt it building for a week, had tried to run Tuesday night, but his wife refused to leave, said they hadn't done anything wrong, said surely James Wilson wouldn't kill people over copper. Wednesday at 5:30, Daniel was loading his family into his car, had finally convinced his wife they needed to go, when the rifle shot came from across the road. The bullet hit him in the throat, severed his carotid, dropped him beside his car. His wife grabbed their children, ran back into the house, locked the doors, called 911, while Daniel bled out in his driveway in 90 seconds, while his 4-year-old daughter watched from the window. Marcus Lee Hargrove, Raymond's middle son, was 24, lived in a rental house in Switchback. Wednesday at 6:45, just after sunset, he was grilling hamburgers in his backyard, trying to pretend everything was normal, trying to convince himself that maybe the Wilsons would stop. The shotgun blast came from the darkness beyond his fence. Marcus dropped without a sound, the grill still smoking beside him, hamburgers burning on the grates. His girlfriend Emily found him 3 minutes later, ran to a neighbor's house screaming, brought back help that could do nothing but confirm what was obvious. Marcus died in his backyard at 6:47, the 11th body that day. While the temperature dropped toward 50 degrees and fog started rolling back into the hollows. Carl Wayne Hargrove, Raymond's youngest son, was 21, married 3 months to Jessica, who was 4 months pregnant. He'd spent all day Wednesday hiding in his trailer with the curtains drawn, refusing to answer the phone, jumping at every sound. At 7:30 that evening, he couldn't take it anymore. Told Jessica he was going to his truck to get the shotgun he kept behind the seat. Said he wasn't going to die without a weapon in his hands. He made it halfway to his truck when the rifle shot came from the tree line. The bullet hit him between the shoulder blades, punched through his heart, exited through his sternum. He fell forward onto the gravel, tried to crawl, couldn't. Died at 7:34 while Jessica screamed from the doorway, while neighbors started gathering, while word spread through Switchback that the Hargrove family was being systematically eliminated. By 8 o'clock Wednesday night, 12 bodies lay across 3 counties. The McDowell County Sheriff's Department received its first call at 5:17 that afternoon, when Thomas Hargrove's wife finally got to a neighbor's phone. By 6:30, they had reports of 5 more. By 7:45, they had 9 confirmed dead and were receiving reports of more. Sheriff Bobby Dale Carson called the state police at 8:15, told them he needed every available officer, told them this was beyond anything his department could handle. State police arrived at 9:30, found a county in chaos, found families barricading themselves in their homes, found roads blocked by men with hunting rifles who weren't letting anyone pass. The FBI arrived Thursday morning at 7 o'clock. 20 agents from the Charleston field office, bringing with them crime scene technicians, forensic specialists, and the assumption that they were dealing with some kind of organized criminal operation. What they found instead was 14 crime scenes spread across 70 square miles of mountain terrain. Special Agent Ronald Keith Patterson had been with the FBI for 19 years, had worked organized crime in Detroit, drug cartels in Miami, bank robberies across 3 states. Nothing had prepared him for what he found in McDowell County that Thursday morning. 14 bodies in 17 hours. No witnesses willing to talk. No physical evidence except shell casings and tire tracks that led nowhere. A community so terrified that people were fleeing their homes, loading trucks with whatever they could carry, heading for relatives in other states. The pattern was obvious once Patterson mapped the victims. All 14 men had been present at Stillhouse Hollow on May 3rd. All 14 had participated in stealing James Wilson's still. The execution list had been methodical, systematic, complete. Patterson interviewed Sarah Wilson at 10:30 Thursday morning in her kitchen while state police searched the property. She sat at the table where her husband had sat every morning for 32 years, drinking coffee, her face showing nothing. Patterson asked where James was. She said she didn't know, hadn't seen him since Tuesday evening. Patterson asked about her sons. She gave the same answer. He asked if she knew about the still. She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much to be intimidated by federal authority and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." Patterson found 4 empty rifle cases in the barn, found cleaning, supplies that smelled like gun solvent, found absolutely nothing that would hold up in court because Sarah had spent Wednesday burning everything that mattered. Thursday afternoon at 2:15, James Wilson walked into the McDowell County Sheriff's Office in Welch with his 3 sons behind him. All 4 men had showered, shaved, dressed in clean clothes. James asked for Sheriff Carson, told the deputy at the desk they were there to surrender. Carson came out of his office, looked at the 4 men, felt something cold settle in his stomach because he knew these men had grown up 3 hollows over from James, had attended the same church for 40 years. He asked if they wanted lawyers. James said no. Said they'd done what needed doing and weren't going to hide from it. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. FBI Special Agent Patterson conducted it personally, recorded every word. James Wilson admitted to planning the operation, to recruiting his sons, to executing Raymond Hargrove at 4:33 Wednesday morning. He provided exact times, locations, methods. When Patterson asked why, James said, "They took what was mine. Mountain law says that demands an answer." When Patterson pointed out that 14 men were dead, that 14 families had been destroyed, James said, "They made their choice when they came onto my property." Michael Wilson confessed to killing Tommy Lee Baker at 9:34, Billy Ray Sloan at 3:07, and Stephen Keith Morrison at 4:15. He showed no remorse, answered every question with factual precision, explained that they'd planned for 2 weeks, scouted locations, waited for the right moment. Robert Wilson admitted to shooting Thomas Hargrove, Daniel Foster, and Daniel Ray Hargrove. He described the mechanics of each killing, the way another man might describe changing oil in a car, technical, methodical, necessary. Travis Wilson confessed to cutting phone lines, to killing Marcus Webb and Carl Hoskins, to serving as lookout and backup. He was 23 years old, would never see freedom again, and seemed to accept that as the price of family loyalty. The trial began October 6, 1986, in the McDowell County Courthouse, a building that had stood since 1893 and had never seen anything like this. The prosecution had confessions, ballistics evidence matching the rifles found in the Wilson barn to shell casings at crime scenes, tire tracks matching Wilson vehicles, and 14 bodies. The defense argued temporary insanity brought on by extreme emotional distress, argued that the theft of the still had triggered a psychological break, argued that mountain culture created a different framework for understanding justice. The jury, 12 people from McDowell County who understood exactly what a moonshine still meant and what its theft represented, deliberated for 4 hours. They found all 4 Wilson men guilty of 14 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Harold Thompson, 68 years old, third-generation McDowell County, who'd presided over hundreds of cases in his 32 years on the bench, sentenced each man to 14 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He said, what happened to your still was theft. What you did in response was murder. The law recognizes no equivalence between those acts. Your culture, your traditions, your code, none of that justifies taking 14 lives. But Thompson also said something else, off the record, to the bailiff who'd served under him for 20 years. Legally, I had no choice. Morally, I'm not sure anyone in this courtroom can judge them without being hypocrites. The system failed everyone involved. The victims' families gave impact statements that lasted 3 days. Martha Hargrove, who'd lost her husband and 3 sons in 1 day, spoke for 40 minutes about futures that would never happen, about grandchildren who'd grow up without fathers, about the emptiness in her house, where 4 men used to be. Jennifer Hargrove, Thomas's widow, described finding her husband bleeding out on the kitchen floor, described her children asking when Daddy was coming back, described the impossibility of explaining that he wasn't. Jessica Hargrove, Carl's pregnant widow, gave birth to a daughter 3 months later, named her Caroline after her father, raised her alone on disability and food stamps, told her daughter stories about a man she'd never meet, who'd made one terrible decision and paid for it with everything. The defense called no witnesses. What could they say? That James Wilson had been a good man before desperation made him a killer? That his sons had been loyal, hardworking, decent before their father asked them to become something else? That mountain justice made sense in a place where law had never protected anyone? The jury had already heard it all, had already made their decision, had already chosen written law over unwritten code. James Edward Wilson entered federal prison in Hazleton, West Virginia, on November 3, 1986. He was 49 years old. He would die there 31 years later, at age 80, having never expressed regret, having never apologized, having maintained until his last breath that he'd done what mountain men do when their legacy is stolen. His wife Sarah visited once a month for 16 years, making the 4-hour drive each way, sitting across from him in the visiting room, talking about nothing important because everything important had ended that June morning. She died in 2002, 65 years old, heart attack in her sleep. The funeral was attended by 47 people. None of her sons could attend. They were serving life sentences in 3 different federal prisons. Michael James Wilson is 71 now, incarcerated at USP McCreary in Kentucky. His wife Rebecca divorced him in 1993, remarried in 1996, moved to Ohio with their children, who are now in their 40s and have never visited their father. Michael has served 38 years, will die in prison, spends his days in the library reading westerns and history books about the Old West, where men settled debts with guns and nobody questioned it. Robert Edward Wilson is 69, incarcerated at USP Lewisburg in Pennsylvania. Linda Sue Morrison, his fiancée, waited 7 years before accepting he was never coming home. She married someone else in 1994, moved to Virginia, had 3 children. She sent Robert a letter in 2001 explaining she couldn't wait anymore, that she'd always loved who he'd been, but couldn't love what he'd become. Robert never responded. He works in the prison library, teaches GED classes to younger inmates, and has received 432 disciplinary infractions for fighting. Travis Lee Wilson is 66, incarcerated at USP Terre Haute in Indiana. He's attempted suicide 3 times, spent 11 years in psychiatric facilities, and has been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, and antisocial personality disorder. He writes letters to the parole board every year, knowing he'll never be paroled, writes letters to the families of the men he killed, knowing they'll never respond, writes letters to himself, trying to understand how he became a man who could shoot another man in the back and sleep fine afterward. 38 years have passed since that June morning in the West Virginia mountains. McDowell County's population has dropped to 18,000, down from 35,000 in 1986. The coal industry never recovered. The towns are smaller, emptier, filled with people too poor to leave and too stubborn to quit. The unemployment rate hovers around 37%. Drug addiction has replaced coal dust as the thing that kills mountain people slowly. Desperation breeds the same desperation that bred the massacre, just with different targets, different weapons, different justifications that sound the same. The Wilson property was sold in 1995 to pay legal fees and restitution to victims' families. A logging company bought it, clear-cut the timber, abandoned it when the lumber market crashed. Today it's overgrown forest, returning to wilderness, completely unmarked except by those who remember. The barn where James gathered his sons still stands, leaning now, roof caving in, home to raccoons and possums and ghosts that tourists don't believe in, but locals won't approach after dark. Stillhouse Hollow, where the still once sat, where 6 years of Wilson family labor was stolen in one night, is accessible only by foot now. The logging road has washed out. The trail is overgrown. But if you know where to look, you can still find the concrete pad where 600 pounds of copper once produced mountain whiskey that people said was the smoothest in 3 counties. The Hargrove properties were sold, one by one, as widows and orphans moved away, seeking fresh starts in places that didn't whisper about what their husbands and fathers had done, Martha Hargrove left West Virginia in 1990, moved to Tennessee to live with her sister, died in 2014, 82 years old, having spent 28 years as a woman who'd lost everything in one day. The houses where men died have new owners now, mostly. Some sit abandoned, windows broken, roofs collapsed, because nobody wants to live where blood was spilled over something as stupid as copper. There's no memorial in McDowell County, no plaque, no historical marker explaining that this was the site of the worst mass killing in West Virginia history. The county just moved on the way. Rural places do, covering scars with silence, with distance, with the simple passage of time that makes everything except pain feel less real. But the story persists in the way mountain stories do, told in hushed voices at diners and gas stations, taught as cautionary tale at churches and community meetings, used as shorthand for what happens when desperation meets tradition, and both collide with the idea that some violations demand blood. FBI Special Agent Ronald Patterson retired in 2005 after 34 years of service. In a 2019 podcast interview about the case, he said, "Legally, the Wilson case was straightforward. 4 men murdered 14 people with premeditation and planning. But morally, it's more complicated. They lived in a place the government had abandoned, where the economy had collapsed, where the only law that mattered was the law men made themselves. Were they murderers? Yes, absolutely. Were they also products of a system that had failed them so completely that mountain justice seemed more real than federal law? Also, yes, I've carried that contradiction for 33 years, and I still don't have an answer. The Wilson Massacre, that's what they call it, ignoring the 14 Hargrove network, dead in favor of the 4 Wilson perpetrators, became legend in Appalachia. A story about the point where honor becomes horror, where protection of legacy becomes destruction of families, where the mountain code that sustained people for 200 years revealed itself as something darker than tradition, something closer to tribal warfare that civilization was supposed to have left behind. James Wilson's story has no heroes. It has a father who valued his family's independence more than 14 human lives, and 14 desperate men who made one catastrophic decision: stealing from the wrong man at the wrong time in the wrong place. It has a system that failed at every level, an economy that destroyed Appalachia and walked away, law enforcement too distant and underfunded to matter, a culture so isolated that codes written in grandfather's blood seemed more legitimate than laws written in Washington, and a justice system that could punish, but it couldn't heal, could cage, but couldn't explain. Was James Wilson a murderer? Yes. He eliminated 14 people with premeditation and planning, some while they slept, some in their own yards, without trial, without mercy, without legal justification. Was he a desperate father trying to protect the only independence his family possessed in a world that had taken everything else? Also, yes, the uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. And that's the most disturbing aspect of this story, because it forces us to confront questions we'd rather avoid. What would we do if someone stole not our money, but our identity, our legacy, the only thing of value we'd built in a life that offered no other opportunities? How far would we go to defend what defines us when the system offers no protection? Does justice exist when law enforcement is 47 miles away and economic collapse has made desperation the default state? Is there a line between righteous anger and unforgivable violence, or does extreme circumstance erase that line entirely, leaving only blood and justifications that sound hollow in courtrooms, but made perfect sense in the moment? James Wilson crossed a boundary no human being should cross, but that boundary existed in a world where a man's livelihood could disappear overnight, where law couldn't reach, where mountain codes said you settled your own debts because nobody else would, where honor mattered more than law because law had never done anything for people like James Wilson except send them to die in mines and wars. There's no easy answer here. No clear moral, no satisfying conclusion where right triumphs and wrong is punished. Just a simple and terrible truth. Violence breeds more violence. Broken systems create desperate people, and sometimes the line between protecting what's yours and becoming what you fear disappears entirely, leaving only corpses and questions and families destroyed on both sides of an equation that never balanced. 40 years have passed since that June morning in the West Virginia mountains. Rural America hasn't healed. It's evolved, adapted, found new ways to struggle. Every year, families face impossible choices when systems abandon them. Every year, some choose violence. The specific circumstances change, the weapons, the motives, the justifications, but the underlying truth remains. Push people far enough, take away everything that gives their lives meaning, offer no legal remedy or hope for justice, and some will push back in ways that shock us, precisely because they mirror our own capacity for darkness when we're stripped of every other option. If this story made you think about justice, legacy, and the price we pay when systems fail and old codes collide with modern law, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about honor and violence.